The coffee cup hit the floor just before the scream. At 8:12 a.m., Samuel Pearson, 71, collapsed mid-step, his body giving in, knees buckling like old hinges rusted shut. His children, Elise and Jacob, stood mid-argument across the kitchen, words sharpened like knives. The shattering ceramics startled them, but not as much as the sound that followed. Silence. A silence too deep, too sudden. Elise froze, fingers still pointed in accusation. Jacob's clenched fists loosened. "Dad," she whispered. Samuel was on the floor, curled like a comma, barely breathing. In his left hand, crumpled, was a yellowed envelope. On it, in uneven handwriting, "To the ones who left me." Jacob stepped forward, slowly, like approaching something sacred or dangerous. Elise couldn't move. The fireplace behind Samuel crackled softly, oblivious to the weight of the moment. The argument died. What remained was fear, and a letter that refused to stay silent any longer. 12 years had passed since this kitchen held all three of them at once. That last time ended with slammed doors, bitter words, and a silence none dared break. Now, the silence was filled with something heavier, mortality. Elise looked at her father's still body, then at Jacob, who refused to meet her eyes. "I didn't think he'd look so small," she whispered. Her voice cracked, not from sadness, but surprise. He had once been a giant in her mind. Now, he looked hollowed. "He never told us he was sick." Jacob finally spoke. "Maybe he didn't want to die needing us." Elise scoffed. "Or maybe he thought we wouldn't come." No one responded. But they had come. That counted for something, didn't it? Elise sat next to Samuel, brushing back the wisps of gray hair from his forehead. Her hand shook. He always looked so strong, even when he scared us. Jacob stood behind her, silent. "Remember when he forgot to pick me up from ballet? I waited outside in the cold for 3 hours." Jacob nodded. "You cried for days." "He never said sorry," she whispered. "Mom did, but not him." They fell quiet. The pain was old, but not dead. It had simply gone underground. Now it surfaced, gasping. Elise whispered, "What if this is how he says sorry?" Jacob answered, "Then I hope he wakes up long enough to mean it." The envelope had fallen from Samuel's grip, landing near the fireplace. Elise picked it up. The ink was smeared at the edges, the paper brittle. She stared at it. "To the ones who left me." Jacob snatched it from her hand. "What are you doing? He meant us," she snapped. "And you know it. It's not a blame letter," Jacob said. "It's a goodbye. You don't know that," Elise said. "You don't get to rewrite what he was just, because he's not awake to defend it." Jacob's jaw tightened. "I'm not rewriting. I'm remembering." For a moment, they looked at each other, not as enemies, but as two children still trying to survive the same father. They heard the sirens in the distance, low and growing. Elise slid down against the refrigerator, wrapping her arms around her knees. Jacob paced near the window. "He built this house with his own hands," she said quietly. "Nail by nail, beam by beam." Jacob didn't look back. "Yeah, he was better at building houses than raising kids." She let out a small laugh, brittle and bitter. "Maybe he thought houses couldn't break your heart." Jacob paused. "Or maybe he thought we wouldn't stay long enough to notice the cracks." They didn't cry. Not yet. But the grief had found its way, in slow, seeping, irreversible. The hospital room was cold, the walls a blank beige that made every breath feel like waiting. Samuel lay unconscious, tubes threading into his arms like quiet apologies. Elise sat beside him, her fingers clutching a paper cup of bad coffee like it was the only thing keeping her upright. "You never said you were proud," she whispered. "Not once." Her voice was steady, but inside it cracked. Jacob stood at the far end of the room, watching rain snake down the window pane. "He wasn't good at saying things. He wasn't good at being a father," Elise replied. Jacob said nothing. The machines beeped rhythmically, impassively. But the ache in the room was alive, years of silence pressing down like gravity. Words Samuel never said filled every inch of space, louder than any siren. Elise stared at the rain. It reminded her of that one day, age 10, when she waited outside school for Samuel. Her backpack soaked, socks squishing. Everyone else left. The janitor asked if someone was coming. He forgot, she had said, pretending not to care. But she did. That forgotten moment shaped her like stone in a river, slowly worn. She learned not to expect too much from people, especially not fathers. Especially not him. Now, years later, she looked at his frail form in the bed, skin pale as paper, and that little girl in the rain rose again in her chest. "I didn't come to forgive you," she whispered. "I came to tell you I remember." Jacob remembered different things. When he was 12, Samuel taught him how to split firewood. "Respect comes from effort, not hugs," Samuel said, as the axe buried deep. Jacob had carried those words like armor. At 28, when his marriage fell apart and he broke down crying in front of his father, Samuel had just nodded once and left the room. No words. No hand on the shoulder. Just that cold departure. It haunted Jacob more than any insult. Now, watching his father barely breathing, Jacob's jaw clenched. "I needed something else," he muttered. "But you were only built for silence." Yet even now, a part of him, small and stubborn, still wanted his father to open his eyes and say the thing that was never said. A nurse entered, changed the IV bag, and left without a word. Elise broke the silence. "He used to yell when I cried. Said I was too emotional." Jacob stared at the floor. He called it strength, but really, he was just scared. "Scared of what?" she asked. "Feeling," Jacob said. "Feeling anything too loud." Elise nodded slowly. "We learned to do the same, didn't we?" The machines beeped softly, the only reply. The pain they carried wasn't explosive. It was the kind that lived beneath the skin. The kind that got passed down like heirlooms, wrapped in silence, handed from one generation to the next. As dusk settled, they sat in silence. Elise curled in the visitor's chair, Jacob leaning against the wall. For once the silence wasn't heavy. It was reflective. "He wrote that letter," Elise whispered. "That means he knew we might come." Jacob nodded slowly. "Or that he hoped we would." Neither dared say it aloud, but both were thinking it. If he didn't wake, this would be their last chance to tell the truth. To ask for answers. To give what wasn't given. Outside, the city moved on. Inside, they waited. Not for a miracle, but for something quieter. Permission to speak the things they had buried for too long. The morning sun cast long fingers across the hospital window, but nothing inside the room felt awake. Elise sat cross-legged on the vinyl chair, holding the letter again. Her fingers traced the creases. "To the ones who left me." She read it aloud now, not for Samuel, but for herself. "I failed you. I know that now. I raised you with silence, not affection. With rules, not reassurance. I wanted to be strong, but I confused that with being distant." Her voice faltered. "I watched you both grow from the doorway, but I was too proud to step in." The paper trembled in her hands. "Why didn't you just tell us?" she asked the man who couldn't answer. And somewhere inside, a truth settled like dust. It's easier to write love after a lifetime of not speaking it. Jacob stood in the courtyard, cigarette unlit in his hand. He hadn't smoked in years. Didn't plan to. But holding it felt like control. His mind drifted to a night long ago, 2007. The day he found out Samuel had attended his ex-wife's funeral. He never told Jacob. Didn't sit beside him. Didn't even call. He just showed up in the back pew, bowed his head, and disappeared before anyone saw. That night, Jacob punched a hole in his apartment wall. Not from rage, but from the sting of being invisible. "You mourned her," he murmured now. "But not with me." Maybe Samuel thought pain was private, but all Jacob had wanted was someone to share it with. Someone who looked him in the eye and said, "You're not alone." Back inside, Elise wandered into the hallway, past the nurse's station, into a forgotten waiting room filled with magazines no one read. She picked one up, then let it fall. What she needed wasn't distraction. It was release. She thought of the time she got accepted into college, and Samuel said nothing. Not even a nod. Later, he left an envelope of cash on her desk. That was his way. Support through action, never affirmation. But what a child remembers isn't the money. It's the silence. It's the look that never came. "You were there," she whispered, "but you were never with me." And that absence shaped her parenting too. Her son once asked, "Do I make you proud?" And she hadn't known how to answer, because she was still waiting to hear it herself. A doctor entered with that neutral face they train for, compassionate, unreadable. "There's swelling in the brain," she said. "We're watching it closely, but time isn't infinite." Jacob returned just in time. "What does that mean?" The doctor met his eyes. "It means you should say what needs to be said." After she left, Elise turned to him. "We're not unplugging anything." Jacob nodded. "No, we're not." He walked to Samuel's bedside, stared at the man who had taught him how to hammer a nail, but never how to cry. "You never let us in, and now we're afraid we waited too long to knock." Elise joined him. Together, for the first time, they stood over him not as fractured children, but as adults desperate to understand the man who raised them. They sat in the cafeteria, the kind of place that smelled like burnt coffee and microwave meal. Neither touched their food. "Do you remember when he taught us to ride bikes?" Elise asked. "He didn't hold the seat, just pushed." Jacob smirked. "And watched us crash. Maybe that was his parenting style," she said. "Let them fall, let them toughen." Except, Jacob added, "we fell and no one picked us up." Elise finally took a sip of her coffee. "What if this, us being here, is us picking him up?" Jacob looked at her. "What if it's also the first time we picked each other up?" They didn't toast, didn't hug, but in that silence between them was something new. Acknowledgement. Not forgiveness yet, but the path to it. Elise returned home briefly to gather clothes and found an old photo album tucked behind the radiator, one she had never seen before. It was filled with photos of them as children, birthdays, recitals, even blurry shots of Jacob's first football game. And in every picture, Samuel was just out of frame, hands visible holding the cake, shoes on the grass line, never the face. Page after page of presents without participation. Then, near the end, a letter slipped out. "I didn't know how to love out loud, but I watched every moment." Elise sat on the floor, album in her lap, the silence in her chest breaking open. He had always been there. Just afraid to be seen. Jacob returned to Samuel's workshop behind the house, a place sealed since their mother's death. He expected dust and silence. What he found was evidence of a secret life. Journals. Dozens. Each one labeled with a year. Inside, reflections, regrets, records of their lives. Elise cried for 3 hours after her interview. "I wanted to hold her. I didn't." Another. "Jacob didn't look back when he left. I deserved that." Jacob sat at the workbench, eyes blurring. Their father hadn't been absent. He had been writing his love in the only language he knew, private, hidden, unspoken. Later that evening, they met back at the hospital, changed. Elise held the photo album. Jacob carried 2 journals. "He didn't hate us," Jacob said quietly. "He hated that he couldn't reach us." Elise nodded, wiping tears. "We weren't abandoned. We just didn't know how he loved." She opened the album. "Look at this." Every moment, he never left. The pain didn't vanish, but something shifted, a fracture softening, a wound being seen for the first time. Not healed, but named. And that naming made all the difference. Back in the hospital room, Elise whispered near her father's ear. "We saw it, Dad. The album, the journals. We see you now. Jacob stood silently behind her, jaw clenched to keep from sobbing. Samuel's hand twitched. Just once. Subtle. Barely there. But enough. Elise gasped. Jacob leaned closer. The machine still beeped, the rhythm unchanged. But the air shifted. Hope didn't need proof. Sometimes it just needed a gesture. And Samuel, even if only briefly, reached back through the fog and said, "I hear you." That night, Elise dreamed of their childhood home. But this time Samuel was there, not in fragments or half shadows, but sitting at the dinner table, smiling gently. "I'm sorry I made you search for proof," he said in the dream. "I didn't know how else to give it." When she woke, the room was quiet, Jacob asleep in a chair. She touched her father's hand, and though it didn't move again, she didn't feel alone anymore. The man who once hid his love had finally been seen. And seeing someone truly might be the closest thing we have to resurrection. The next morning, Samuel awoke. Just slightly, eyes fluttering, breath deeper. Elise was there. She rushed to his side, clutching his hand. His lips barely moved, but she heard it. "You came back." Her tears fell freely. "We never stopped being your children. We were just hurting." He gave a faint smile. Jacob entered seconds later, stunned to see Samuel conscious. "Dad." Samuel blinked at him, then whispered, "Still stubborn, huh?" Jacob laughed through the tears. "Guess I learned from the best." They didn't need a dramatic reunion. Just this, presence. A few words. After a lifetime of silence, even a whisper could sound like thunder. Later that afternoon, Samuel asked for the letter. Jacob placed it in his trembling hands. "I wrote this when I thought I was done," Samuel said weakly. "Turns out, I wasn't done needing you." Elise knelt beside him. "We read it, and we found the rest. The photos. The journals." Samuel closed his eyes, sighing. "I was never brave enough to say the words out loud." Jacob replied, "You don't have to now. We heard them anyway." There was no dramatic music. Just beeping monitors and 3 people trying to learn how to exist in the same room, honestly, for the first time. "I used to think love had to be loud," Elise said softly. "Big gestures. Hallmark endings." Samuel smiled faintly. "Turns out, it's the quiet things." Jacob nodded. "Like showing up, even when it's hard." Samuel reached for both their hands. "If I could start over, I'd tell you every day, you mattered more than pride, more than silence." His voice cracked. "I just didn't know how." There in that sterile room, surrounded by IVs and regret, something holy happened. Not forgiveness given, not apologies demanded, but a truth spoken aloud that none of them had dared believe. Love doesn't vanish. It waits. That evening, Samuel asked for one last thing, to sit in a chair by the window. The nurse wheeled him over. He watched the sunset bleed across the skyline, gold melting into violet. "When your mother died," he murmured, "I didn't know how to grieve and be a father at the same time." Elise said nothing, just rested her hand on his shoulder. Jacob stood beside him, quiet. Samuel's voice broke again. "I failed you." Jacob whispered, "No, you just didn't finish yet." Samuel's eyes filled with sunset, brimmed with tears. He hadn't given them everything, but he gave them this. As night returned, Samuel drifted into sleep. No alarms, no panic, just rest. Jacob and Elise sat on either side of him, silent guardians. The monitors blinked steadily, a soft lullaby of life. "I used to hate this place," Elise whispered. "Now I'm afraid to leave it." Jacob replied, "Because for once, we're not broken in different corners." They looked at their father, flawed, quiet, but finally known. And in that moment, they realized something no scientist could measure, no therapist could teach. The hardest truths about happiness are buried inside pain. And sometimes, love waits until the last chapter to be understood. Samuel passed away 3 days later, quietly, just before dawn. No dramatic gasp, no final words. Just a slow fade, like a candle burning through its last inch of wax. Elise was there, holding his hand. Jacob stood at the window, watching the sky begin to pale. There were tears, yes, but not of regret. Of release. He waited for us to understand. Elise said softly. And we did. Jacob nodded, voice low. He wasn't perfect. But neither are we. In death, Samuel didn't vanish. He became something else, a part of them. And this time they would carry him, not as a ghost but as a father finally seen. They didn't plan a grand funeral. No glossy speeches. Just a small backyard gathering with a few neighbors, some old co-workers, and a table of coffee and stories. Elise read from one of Samuel's journals. I never knew how to be a good father. I only knew how to survive. Then Jacob stepped up, holding the photo album. He never stopped watching. He just didn't know how to step into the frame. Some nodded. Some cried. But all felt the quiet dignity of a man who failed, learned and tried again at the very end. In that, there was honor. Weeks later, Elise sat with her daughter on the porch. Grandpa used to sit here too, she said. He'd drink his coffee and write in notebooks. No one was allowed to read. Her daughter asked, was he mean? Elise paused. No, just scared. And sometimes fear wears the mask of silence. The little girl thought about that. I think I would have liked him. Elise smiled. He would have loved you. Fiercely. In that moment, she realized she was doing what Samuel couldn't, telling the truth before it was too late. That was her inheritance. And it felt sacred. Jacob visited the old workshop one last time. He packed the journals into boxes, labeled them, and slid one into his coat. On the first page, if you're reading this, I'm already gone, but maybe now you'll finally know I was watching the whole time. Jacob closed it, eyes wet. He didn't cry often, but this felt right. He wasn't mourning a father he never had anymore. He was honoring a father he finally understood. Sometimes, understanding doesn't erase the pain, but it gives it shape. And Jacob would carry that shape forward, not as a wound, but as a map. Months passed. The world moved on. But something lingered in both Jacob and Elise. A softness, a readiness to speak before silence returned. On what would have been Samuel's 72nd birthday, they met at the old house, now empty. They didn't bring gifts. Just each other. He taught us the hard way, Elise said, but we learned. Jacob placed a photo on the mantel, Samuel, smiling in a rare candid shot. He's here now, Jacob said, tapping his chest. And maybe that's what happiness really is. Not perfection, not loud joy, but the quiet knowing that we tried, that we saw, that we stayed. The seasons changed. Leaves turned, fell, and grew again. The house remained empty, but not abandoned. Elise visited once a week, watering the garden her mother once loved. Jacob came every now and then to fix small things, squeaky doors, cracked glass, leaning fence posts. Not because anyone asked, but because they now understood. Care is love without announcement. They didn't speak much during those visits. But in the silence there was peace. The kind that doesn't demand understanding, just presence. And maybe that's what Samuel had been reaching for all along. Quiet love misread, but real. One day, Elise's daughter asked, "What made Grandpa happy?" Elise paused. No simple answer. Not medals, not retirement, not even birthdays. Maybe, she said, it was watching things grow, watching us even if he didn't know how to say it. Her daughter nodded solemnly. Did he say it at the end? Elise smiled faintly. No, but he gave us enough to hear it anyway. That was the truth no science could explain. Happiness isn't always visible. It's stitched into what's left behind. In journals, in habits, in people who finally learned how to love better than they were taught. Jacob found himself talking more, to friends, to colleagues, to his own children. Not loudly, not perfectly, but honestly. One night, While tucking in his son, he said, "You're the best part of my day." His son blinked. "Why?" Jacob hesitated, then said, "Because I see myself in you, but better." That night, Jacob stood in the hallway alone. He hadn't cried in months. But this time he did. Not from pain, but from release. From the knowledge that cycles can be broken, not with grand gestures, but with quiet words spoken before it's too late. Elise sat at her desk, finishing the last entry in a new journal. The first she'd ever written for herself. "You taught me how to be silent," she wrote, "but life taught me how to speak again." She placed the journal beside Samuel's old ones, now kept in a trunk under her bed. Not to hide them, but to honor them. She no longer feared becoming her father, because now she could carry the best parts forward and leave the rest behind. Her daughter entered the room holding a crayon drawing. "I made this for you." Elise took it with tears in her eyes. "Thank you, baby. I'll keep it forever." The fireplace was cold now. The photo still sat on the mantel, Samuel's rare smile frozen in time. But the silence in the house no longer hurt. It hummed softly, like a lullaby. Jacob and Elise stood beside each other, saying nothing. Then Elise whispered, "Do you think he ever found happiness?" Jacob didn't answer right away. Then he said, "Maybe happiness isn't something you find. Maybe it's something you leave behind." And in that moment, the answer wasn't in words. It was in the echo of their father's life, the pieces broken, mended, passed on. The story didn't end with him. It began with the ones who finally stayed.